My name is Ruth Kellerman. I am 71 years old, and I want to tell you, Megan, about the evening of March 14th, when you looked at my son across your kitchen island and said, "Your mother doesn't need to be in the delivery room. She doesn't need to be in the waiting room. She doesn't need to be informed," and assumed I would do what I always did. I want you to know what I was thinking at the exact moment Connor repeated those words to me over the phone, his voice thin and apologetic. At 8:47 on a Wednesday night, while I stood in my garage holding a $60 onesie I had hand-embroidered with my first grandchild's initials. The embroidery was wrong, actually. You had changed the name and not told me. I found that out later. You said, "She doesn't need to be informed," and I said, "All right." You heard surrender. What you couldn't hear was the decision I had already made. I held that onesie with the wrong name stitched across the chest, held it with both hands like a document I was about to file. My thumbs pressed into the cotton so hard I could feel the grain of the thread beneath them. I didn't move. I didn't set it down. Something behind my sternum went cold and precise, the way it does when I find a decimal out of place in a column of 10,000 numbers, and my hands stay still while my mind runs backward through every entry that touches it. But I'm not here to talk to Megan, not really. She'll hear this eventually, or she won't. What I'm here to do is talk to you. Before I tell you what I found when I started looking, what time is it where you are? I want to know how many people heard something they recognized in that opening. I spent 43 years as a fiduciary auditor for estates and trusts. Not tax preparation, that's what people assume when I say I worked with money. What I actually did was trace where assets went after someone died, verify that executors followed the terms of the will, and identify when distributions had been redirected, delayed, or structurally altered before beneficiaries ever saw them. I could read a trust amendment the way a radiologist reads a chest film, not the words, the shadows, the things present that shouldn't be, and the things absent that should. I retired at 68, but the pattern recognition doesn't retire. You don't stop noticing when numbers don't add up, just because you've stopped being paid to notice. That skill had protected other people's families for over 4 decades. It was about to audit my own. Connor is my only living child. His brother David died in a car accident in 1996. He was 19, Connor was 14, and he became, overnight, the entire future of this family. I don't say that to be dramatic. I say that because it is the structural fact around which every decision I made for the next 27 years was organized. I sold the house in Briarcliff 3 months after the funeral because every room in it had David's height marks on the doorframe, and Connor couldn't sleep. I moved us to a smaller place in Ashford, took the equity, put it into Connor's college fund, and started driving 40 minutes each way to work instead of 12. My husband Gerald handled grief by not handling it. He was gone, not dead, just absent in the ways that mattered, within 2 years. Divorce finalized in 1999. I didn't contest the terms. I kept the house, and Connor. Gerald kept everything else, and started a new life in North Carolina with a woman named Diane, who I'm told is perfectly nice. So it was me and Connor. For a long time, that was enough. I put him through school. Undergraduate at University of Vermont, then an MBA he decided he wanted halfway through his first job. I took out a second mortgage in 2011 to cover the gap his loans didn't reach, $41,000. He said he'd pay it back. I said don't worry about it. He didn't, and I didn't. That's how it was between us. I gave, he received. I called it love. He called it nothing, because when something has always been there, you don't call it anything at all. The irony was that I had spent my entire professional life ensuring that dead people's wishes were honored precisely as written, that no executor skimmed, no trustee delayed, no beneficiary was quietly erased from the distribution chain. I was the person families hired when they suspected someone was rewriting the terms, and the whole time, someone in my own family was rewriting mine. Megan came into the picture in 2017. She was 26, Connor was 35, and she had the kind of organized confidence that I initially mistook for competence. She planned things, She managed things. She had spreadsheets for holidays. I thought, good. Connor needs structure. What I didn't see, because I wasn't looking, was that structure was not the same as inclusion. Her systems had a perimeter, and I was on the outside of it from the start. The first year was fine, polite dinners. She called me Mrs. Kellerman, which I corrected gently. Ruth is fine, and she smiled and kept calling me Mrs. Kellerman. By the second year, the dinners became quarterly. By the third, I was being informed of plans after they were finalized. By the time they married in 2020, a small ceremony, COVID was the stated reason, though every friend of Megan's was present, and none of mine were. I had already been moved from participant to audience. But I adapted. That's what mothers do when the alternative is losing their son entirely. I sent gifts. I didn't comment on the wedding I wasn't consulted about. I showed up when invited, stayed in the parameters drawn for me, and told myself this was normal. Daughters-in-law have their own families, their own traditions, their own sense of how things should go. I told myself I was being modern, flexible, respectful of boundaries. What I was actually being was erased, gradually, methodically, with spreadsheets. Then the pregnancy announcement came in October 2023, not from Connor, not by phone, a group text that included me, Megan's parents, Megan's two sisters, and Megan's college roommate. I found out I was going to be a grandmother in the same message as a woman named Brooke, who I had never met. I read that text in the parking lot of a Walgreens at 3:14 in the afternoon. I sat in my car for 9 minutes. I know it was 9, because I watched the dashboard clock. Something in me was doing what it had always done, noting the time, noting the sequence, filing the data point in a column that was getting longer than I wanted to admit. Connor called me later that evening. He sounded happy. I told him I was happy. That part was true. What I didn't say was that I had already begun, quietly and without any conscious intention, to observe the pattern of my own exclusion with the same forensic attention I used to apply to trust distributions. March 14th was the delivery room conversation. That was the surface insult. Layer 1. What the audience already knows. But what you don't know yet is that by March 14th, I had already found something that made the delivery room conversation almost irrelevant. 2 weeks before that phone call, I had been at Connor and Megan's house helping set up the nursery. Megan was at her mother's. Connor was at work. I was assembling a crib, the one I had purchased. $460, the same model Megan had registered for, but in the finish, she had mentioned preferring in a conversation she probably doesn't remember having. While moving boxes in the closet, to reach an outlet, I found a manila folder on the shelf above the hanging rod. It was labeled Estate, RK. I should not have opened it, but I am a fiduciary auditor, and when I see a folder with my initials on it in someone else's closet, my hands open it before my conscience objects. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a printed screenshot of my county's property tax assessment showing the appraised value of my home, $387,000. The second was a spreadsheet, Megan's formatting. I recognized the font and the color-coded headers, listing my assets as best she could estimate them: house, retirement accounts, the investment account Connor knew about, and an insurance policy I hadn't told anyone about. The total at the bottom was highlighted in green, $1,044,000. The third document was a printed email from Megan to her sister Jocelyn, dated 5 months earlier, that read, Jay, talk to C about his mom's estate plan. She still hasn't updated her will since 2005. If she doesn't change it, everything defaults to him as sole heir anyway. But I want to make sure there's no chance she does something impulsive and redirects to a charity or something. Working on keeping things smooth on my end. We'll update after nursery setup. I read that email standing in my grandchild's closet with a Phillips head screwdriver still in my left hand. I read it twice. My fingers were steady. I could feel my pulse in my wrists, slow and even, the way it gets when I am reading a document that changes the terms of everything I thought I understood. Cold math moment. I stood in that closet for what must have been 4 minutes, and I was already counting backward through every moment of managed politeness, every scheduled exclusion, every smiling refusal to let me closer, and recalculating what it had been for. Then I put the folder back. I finished assembling the crib. I drove home. Layer 2, the hidden setup. That spreadsheet was not casual curiosity. It was structured due diligence. Megan had researched my assets the way an acquisitions analyst researches a target. The property tax screenshot was not publicly available in our county without filing a records request, which meant she had either called the assessor's office or accessed the record through a paid service. Neither is something you do accidentally while planning a nursery. She had also estimated my insurance policy within $12,000 of its actual value, which told me she had either seen correspondence I left at their house or asked Connor directly, and he had answered without understanding why. Over the next 3 weeks, this was before the delivery room phone call, before I knew I was being blocked, I conducted my own review. Quietly, professionally, the way I had done it for 43 years for other people's families. I called my insurance carrier and requested an access log on my account. 2 unauthorized login attempts in the prior 6 months, both from an IP address I didn't recognize. I contacted my estate attorney, Richard Pratt, and confirmed that no one had called his office requesting copies of my documents. But Richard told me something I hadn't expected. Connor had called 8 months earlier asking general questions about how a will works when there's only one beneficiary and no trust. Richard had answered in generalities, assuming Connor was asking for a friend. He hadn't been. Layer 3, the older pattern. I pulled my bank records for the prior 3 years. In 2021, Connor had asked to borrow $12,000 for what he described as a roof repair. I had wired the money to an account number he texted me. When I pulled the routing information, it matched a joint checking account at a credit union I had never heard of, not Connor's primary bank, and not any institution he had mentioned. I called the credit union directly. The account was in both Connor and Megan's names. Opened in 2020, the year of the wedding. The roof repair was never done. I know, because I drove past the house and looked. Same roof. Same missing shingle on the southeast corner I had noticed 2 years ago. In 2022, he asked for $8,000 for a dental emergency. Same account, same credit union. Same routing number. I hadn't checked at the time because I trusted my son. When I checked now, the pattern was clean. The requests came at intervals that avoided looking like a pattern, and the amounts were calibrated to be large enough to matter and small enough not to trigger my professional instincts. They nearly succeeded. Layer 4, the deeper fraud. I want to make sure you understand what I found next, Megan, because this is the part you thought no one would find. The investment account Connor knew about, the one listed on Megan's spreadsheet, held approximately $210,000. It was earmarked in my mind, though not legally, as a future gift for my grandchildren. What Megan's spreadsheet did not list was a second account. One I had opened in 2004, the year before my current will was drafted, at a different brokerage. This account held just under $300,000. It existed because a client had once told me, during the most painful audit of my career, "Ruth, always keep something in a room they don't know about." I had taken that advice literally, but here is what made me go still for the second time. When I logged into that second account to verify its security, I found a failed login attempt from 4 months prior. The email address used in the attempt was not Connor's. It was not Megan's personal email. It was an email address I had never seen, rk.astate.review.gmail.com. Someone had created a dedicated email address, using my initials and the word estate, specifically to attempt to access my financial accounts. The account creation date, which I obtained by entering it into Google's account recovery flow, was 11 months prior. 11 months. This was not recent. This was infrastructure. I printed everything. I organized it the way I had organized evidence packages for 43 years, chronologically, with source verification on every page, and a summary sheet cross-referencing dates, amounts, and access attempts. I put it in a binder, a black 3-ring binder with a clear pocket on the front. I slid a single sheet into that pocket, the spreadsheet from the nursery closet, Megan's color-coded estimate of what I was worth. The blocking came on March 22nd, 8 days after the delivery room phone call. I texted Connor to ask how Megan was feeling. No response. I called the next day. Voicemail. I tried Megan's number. Blocked. I checked every platform. Instagram. Blocked. Facebook. Blocked. My email to Megan bounced back with a delivery failure. She had filtered my address. I was not ghosted. I was architecturally removed from every communication channel in a single coordinated action. I said nothing. I want you to understand how specific that silence was. I did not call Connor's office. I did not show up at their door. I did not send a letter. I did not contact Megan's mother. I did not post anything online. I sat in my kitchen on a Tuesday morning with a cup of Earl Grey that had gone cold, and I did absolutely nothing. The same way I do nothing when I find the first discrepancy in an audit, because the first response is never the right response. The first response is the one they're expecting. Instead, I called Richard Pratt and scheduled an appointment for the following week. Then I called my financial advisor. Then I sat down at my desk and began drafting a new will. My friend Janet, she's been in my life since 1988, the kind of friend who brings soup and doesn't ask questions, noticed something was wrong in April. She came over, and I was sitting at the dining room table with the binder open. She saw the spreadsheet. She didn't ask what it was. She just sat down. I didn't explain. I wasn't ready. She said, "Whatever this is, Ruth, I'm here when you want to say it." Then she made tea and left. That was the beginning of Janet's arc in this story, and I need you to understand that she didn't start out on my side. She started out on the side of keeping the family together, which is where most good people start, and where most good people stay too long. Janet called me 2 weeks later and told me she had run into Connor at the grocery store. She had asked about me, Connor had said, and Janet reported this with visible discomfort. "Mom's fine, she's just adjusting to not being the center of attention." Janet repeated this to me carefully, like she was placing a glass on the edge of a table. I could see her deciding whether I was the problem, whether I was the overbearing mother-in-law who couldn't let go. She was halfway to believing it. I could see the math she was doing behind her eyes, and I didn't interrupt it, because I had been doing the same math for years, and I knew how the columns balanced when you only had half the data. I rewrote my will in May. The previous version left everything to Connor as sole heir. The new version established a trust, not for Connor, not for Megan, for my future grandchildren, directly, administered by an independent trustee. Connor would receive a specific bequest of $30,000. The house, the accounts, the insurance, all held in trust until the grandchildren reached 25, with provisions for education and medical expenses before then. I also added a provision designating the remainder, should no grandchildren survive to inherit, to a scholarship fund at the University of Vermont in David's name. I told no one. In June, the baby arrived. A girl. Eleanor. I learned her name from Janet, who learned it from the internet. Megan posted it on Instagram with a photo I was not permitted to see on her private account. Janet screenshotted it and texted it to me with no commentary. I looked at my granddaughter's face on a 4-inch screen, sitting on my bed at 11 o'clock at night, and I did not cry. I set the phone on the nightstand face down and stared at the ceiling. My chest felt like someone had placed a flat stone on it, smooth and cold and perfectly centered. By August, I had the binder complete. 37 pages, every document sourced, every timeline verified. I called Connor's office line, the one Megan couldn't block, and asked him to meet me for dinner. He sounded startled. He agreed. I named the restaurant, Bellingham's downtown, the private dining room Connor had rented for Megan's 30th birthday 2 years ago. The room with the walnut paneling and the French doors Connor had specifically chosen because he said it made him feel like he'd arrived somewhere. He loved that room. He had taken a photo of himself in it and used it as his LinkedIn profile picture for 6 months. He brought Megan. I knew he would. I had set one additional place. Megan walked in and saw me already seated with the binder on the table, and Richard Pratt sitting to my left. Her face did something fast and controlled, a flicker of recalculation. She sat down. Connor sat down. He looked at Richard and then at me and said, "Mom, what is this?" I said, "A correction." I opened the binder. I placed the first document on the table, the property tax assessment found in the nursery closet, and said, "This was in your hall closet, filed under my initials." Megan's response was immediate. "I don't know how that got there." I placed the second document, the spreadsheet. "This is your formatting, your font, your color scheme. I've seen it on your meal plans, your vacation itineraries, and the seating chart at your wedding." I was seated in the back of. Connor said, "Mom, you're making this into something it's not." I said nothing. I placed the email to Jocelyn. "That's a private conversation," Megan said. "You had no right to read that." "And the email address, rk.estate.review, I said. "Created 11 months ago. Used to attempt access to my investment accounts." "Whose was that?" Megan looked at Connor. Connor looked at the table. The walnut surface of it. His monument. "This is really inappropriate," Megan said. "Bringing a lawyer to a family dinner. You're trying to intimidate us." "Connor," she said, "we should leave." "After everything I've done to make you feel welcome in this family," Megan said, and her voice had taken on a specific register I had heard before. The managed warmth, the calibrated hurt, the performance of someone who believes they are the injured party because they have been rehearsing it. Richard Pratt set his glasses on the table. He had not spoken yet. He had been my estate attorney for 19 years. He had drafted both versions of my will. He was 74 years old and had the particular authority of a man who has watched families disassemble themselves over money for half a century and is no longer impressed by any of it. "For the record," Richard said, "Connor contacted my office 8 months ago asking about the structure of his mother's estate. I provided general information, as I would to anyone, but I also noted the call in Mrs. Kellerman's file, as I do with all inquiries related to a client's estate plan. It is part of my standard practice. Mrs. Kellerman did not ask me to monitor this. I do it for every client. I have the logged note with the date, time, and summary." He placed the note on the table. "I am here tonight because Mrs. Kellerman asked me to witness the delivery of these documents and to confirm that her estate plan has been lawfully revised." That revision was completed in May of this year. The room was quiet. The kind of quiet that walnut paneling is supposed to make dignified, but which instead felt like the silence inside a sealed envelope. Connor looked at me. Not at the binder. At me. "Mom," he said, "you changed your will?" I delivered my key line in the same voice I have used to deliver audit findings to boardrooms full of people who did not want to hear them. "You didn't forget to include me, Connor. You outsourced the decision to exclude me and then let someone build a financial strategy around my death." He didn't speak. Megan didn't speak. Richard gathered his papers. I stood up. I left the binder on the table. Every page. I walked out of the private dining room with the French doors and the walnut paneling, Connor's favorite room, the one that made him feel like he'd arrived, and I did not look back. The consequences arrived the way consequences do when they have been deferred for years. They don't crash, they accumulate, the way the original injuries did, in a sequence so measured, it almost looks like weather. Within 2 weeks, Connor called 3 times. I answered none of them. He left voicemails I listened to once each. The first was angry. The second was confused. The third was quiet and short. "Mom, I don't know what to do." I saved it. I didn't respond. Megan's sister Jocelyn, the one who received the email, called me in September. I don't know how she got my number. She said she wanted to apologize for not saying something when she first read Megan's message. She said she had felt uncomfortable at the time, but assumed it was just Megan being Megan. She said she had told Megan it was a bad idea. I asked what specifically she had told Megan was a bad idea. Jocelyn paused and said, "The spreadsheet. Not the blocking, not the delivery room exclusion, the spreadsheet." Jocelyn knew about the financial surveillance and had limited her objection to the documentation method, not the intent. I thanked her for calling. I did not tell her it was okay. She asked if I was all right, and I said I was. She said, "I should have done more." I said yes. We hung up. It was an honest call, and it was not enough, and both of those things were true. By October, Connor and Megan's communication patterns had shifted in ways I heard about secondhand. Janet, who had by then seen the binder, all 37 pages, and had gone very quiet for 2 days afterward before calling me, with a voice that sounded like she had been crying, told me that Connor had moved into the guest room. Megan had told people I was unstable and had ambushed them with a lawyer. This version circulated through the family's social periphery for about 3 weeks before Richard Pratt, without my asking, sent a brief, factual letter to Megan's parents summarizing the documented evidence and the legal basis for the estate revision. He sent it because, he told me, the record should not be established by the loudest voice. Megan's parents stopped repeating her version. I don't know what they said to her privately. I don't need to know. In November, I received a handwritten letter from Connor. It was 4 pages long. It was the most honest thing he had written in years, and also the most painful, because honesty that arrives only after exposure carries a weight that honesty offered freely does not. He said he had not known about the email address, the RK estate.review account. He said he had known about the spreadsheet and had told himself it was Megan being organized. He said he had known about the blocking and had told himself I would come around. He said he understood if I needed space. He said he wanted to be in my life, I wrote back. 2 paragraphs. I told him the trust was irrevocable and would not be changed. I told him I loved him and that the door was open when he was ready to walk through it, without someone else deciding whether it should be locked. I told him Eleanor was welcome in my home anytime, and that I would never use her as a bargaining chip because I had seen what that does to children. I had audited the estates of families that did, and the damage outlasted the money every time. In January, Connor came to my house alone. He brought Eleanor. She was 7 months old and had Connor's eyes and David's chin, a detail I will never say out loud to Connor, but which I hold like a second heartbeat inside my chest. We sat in my living room. He held her on his lap, and I sat across from them in the green armchair, and we talked about nothing important for an hour. It was the best hour I had had in 2 years. Janet, who had watched all of this unfold, who had doubted me, and then believed me, and then gone quiet, and then come back. Janet showed up that evening, with a bottle of wine, and a look on her face, like someone who had just finished reading something very long, and very sad, and needed to sit near another person. She said, "I almost told you to apologize to them. Back in April, I almost told you to just let it go." She set the wine on the counter. "I'm sorry I almost did that." I poured 2 glasses. I didn't tell her it was fine, because it wasn't, but I handed her the glass, and that was something. The thing I rebuilt was the thing I had put off longest. In February, I enrolled in a bookbinding course at the Community Arts Center. Something I had wanted to do since 2008, when a client's estate included a collection of hand-bound journals that I had cataloged with more attention than any trust document I'd ever read. I had told Connor about it once. He had said, "That doesn't seem like you, Mom." It was exactly like me. He just hadn't been paying attention. "Megan, I said at the beginning of this that there was one thing I never said to you directly. Here it is. You could have just asked me for help. I would have given you everything. I'm sitting at a desk in my living room now. It's early evening. There's a cup of Earl Grey, hot this time, and a piece of linen paper I cut and folded myself this afternoon. My second binding project. A small notebook with a cover the color of oatmeal. On the first page, I've written Eleanor's name, the right one, in my handwriting. And this time, the letters are exactly where they should be. Some people believe that setting a boundary with your own child is the coldest thing a parent can do. I understand why they believe that. For a long time, I believed it too. I believed that love meant absorption, taking every cost into the body, metabolizing the insult so quietly that the person causing it never even had to notice. I believed that silence was grace. What I learned, in the closet of my grandchild's nursery holding a screwdriver and a spreadsheet I was never supposed to find, was that silence is not grace when it protects the pattern instead of the person. Silence in the presence of documented harm is not patience, it is participation. The difference between loyalty and obedience is this. Loyalty allows you to say, "This is wrong," and still remain. Obedience requires you to say nothing and call it love. I was obedient for years. I was loyal the night I sat in that restaurant and opened the binder. Those two things feel the same from the outside. From the inside, they are opposite directions of the same door. Is there someone in your life you've been describing in third person, to friends, to your therapist, to yourself late at night, because saying it to them directly would require you to believe your own evidence? What would you say if you finally believed it? This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, education, and dramatic reflection. We hope it reminded you that your dignity is not negotiable, and that setting a boundary, even a painful one, can be an act of love for yourself and everyone the pattern would have reached next.